Well, I didn't get to talk to all of you during that opening question, and I'm wondering if any of you chose as your favorite snow game the old winter game, King of the Mountain. Has anyone played this? It's one of those games that I look at now and I think, how did no one ever call a lawyer? For those who don't know, let me explain. All you need is a huge mountain of snow. And the idea is that everyone tries to scramble to the top of the snow pile in order to claim the title King of the Mountain. You can shove and push and do whatever it takes, but as soon as you get there, someone else is probably already waiting to shove you off. The game is, by definition, relentless, and no one ever really wins. It just goes on until someone gets tired, or usually until someone gets terribly hurt. King of the Mountain, though, is a great game when it's just a game. But all too often, that snow pile becomes our resume, or our GPA, or the corporate ladder, and then it's way less fun. I'm fine with pulling people down and worrying about protecting my place at the top for an hour on a snow day, but when life becomes an endless game of King of the Mountain, that's pretty miserable. Which brings us to King Herod. In our gospel reading this morning, Magi from the east have observed an astrological sign, and they've determined that a new king has been born for the Jewish people. These Magi travel to the capital city of Jerusalem, and they ask the current king, Herod, about this new birth that they've observed in the stars. And we're told that when King Herod hears this news from the Magi, he is terrified. He reacts like someone who reads one comment online and is convinced the whole internet has turned against him. But of course, he reacts this way. He was the king. He was at the top of the mountain. And this visit from the Magi announced an unanticipated threat to his power. But the text tells us something else here as well. It's not just Herod who is terrified, but the text says that all of Jerusalem was terrified along with him. This is what happens when life becomes an endless game of King of the Mountain. When everything depends on holding on to what's ours, fear can spread very quickly. One anxious ruler makes an entire city anxious. You see, Jerusalem and the people of Jerusalem weren't afraid of a baby. They were afraid of what Herod might do now that he felt threatened. And this doesn't just happen to ancient kings. This type of destructive fearfulness happens whenever people feel like they have something to lose. I see this in myself almost every weekday morning. I turn into a drill sergeant trying to get the kids out the door on time for the bus, even though I know that if they miss the bus, I own a car. But in that moment, you'd think that missing the bus would trigger a congressional investigation. And for some of us, this tendency shows up in other ways. Maybe in school or at work, where being the best student or the best employee feels like the only way to matter. And that need to be at the top causes you to cut corners or copy answers or just quietly hope that someone else will stumble because falling behind feels unbearable. For many of us, though, maybe this shows up just in the way we present ourselves to the world. We make sure that people see how put together we are. We downplay our failures and gloss over our struggles and never admit when we're wrong and keep our doubts to ourselves because we feel like we have to protect this image that we've got everything under control. It's all the same story. We live by this quiet competition that keeps us anxious and guarded and afraid to be honest. Last year, I had our faith formation staff team at Bethany read a book that names this way of living with painful clarity. It's called Never Enough by Jennifer Brainey Wallace. And one of its central insights is that our culture has quietly turned life into a constant competition, one where our worth is always being measured and ranked and compared. The book shows in painful anecdotal details where this mindset actually gets us. It leads us to higher anxiety, deeper exhaustion, and a growing fear of falling behind. We become less willing to rest, less willing to admit weakness, and less willing to be honest because success has become this thing that we have to defend, and failure becomes something we have to hide. When you live in a world where there's never enough success or enough security or enough room at the top of the mountain, then anyone can be seen as the enemy, and any hint of change can seem like a threat. That's why Herod is so undone by the visit from the Magi. And it's why Jerusalem is afraid along with him, because their never enough mindset is telling them that there's no room for a new king. No, a new king would surely make things worse. But that's where these Magi really show us God's hope for the world. The Magi, or the wise men, as they are often called, deliver the news to King Herod that goes over like a lead balloon, but they don't just wallow there with Herod. They continue their search, and when these wise men see the star stop over the place where the child is, the gospel tells us that they are overwhelmed with joy, which is remarkable, because nothing about what they find should feel reassuring. The star didn't stop over a palace. There were no armed guards out front. There were no obvious signs of strength or kingly power, just a child and his ordinary, humble parents. But that's precisely the point. The Magi's joy comes not when they learn that there is a king, but rather when they discover what kind of king he is. The wise men realize that the future of the world is not resting on Herod's throne or in Rome's violence or their own ability to get it right. It's resting in the hands of this child. And so that means that God is doing something new. God has found a different way to lead and rule. So the joyful wise men kneel and worship and give this child extravagant gifts. And maybe that's why we call them wise. Because in our never enough world where being king means constantly shoveling everyone else off the mountain, in this type of world, these outsiders from the East recognized that God was introducing a different type of kingly power. Jesus will grow up to be a person who heals instead of conquers, one who forgives instead of punishes, one who eats with outcasts instead of currying favor with the powerful. Eventually, Jesus' actions will unsettle the religious and political leaders because they'll feel threatened by the ways that Jesus isn't playing their game. They will feel as if their power is being threatened, and so they'll have him put to death. But of course, Jesus' death is just another example of how God was showing the world a different form of power. Because on the cross, Jesus takes this fear that we all live with, this nagging concern that there is not enough and that we are not enough, and he completely disproves it by sacrificing his life for ours. Which is really good news. Because between my receding hairline and to-do list that refuses to acknowledge reality, I'd be in serious trouble if my worth depended on having it all together. And I'm guessing you might feel the same way. Thankfully, Jesus has already settled the question of our worth. And so we don't have to live like Herod anymore. I'm not saying that Jesus' death and resurrection magically makes us into better people, but rather it invites us to believe that we no longer have to be afraid in the same ways. We get to be people who compete less. Not because we're more disciplined, but simply because we're less anxious. Like the wise men, we discover joy in this newborn king because Jesus allows us to believe that there is enough and that we are enough. Jesus does not come to scare us into obedience, nor does he come to make us better climbers. He comes to rescue us from the lie that life is a mountain that we must defend and a competition with our peers. Jesus comes to free us and transform us into people who love and serve and give just as generously as he first did for us. Amen.